These are disturbing times in America and in the West. I recognize that there's the rest of the world, but it's hard to write a paper in which you're dealing with everything. Many in the citizenry want a government that pays no attention to the concept of economic justice and pays no respect for human needs, while many others want a minimal government, one that does not require wearing masks indoors, getting vaccinated before working in hospitals, and speed limits on the roads. Adding to the dissonance, some want a government that exercises control over whole industries, what scholars call corporatism, as in fascist times. Here I want to consider other dimensions of the situation. Developments in the economy over the past 5 decades have led to much frustration and divisiveness or alienation in society. There appears to have been widespread losses of morale among many in the labor force. In Britain, in America, one tension arises from the wider gap between the rewards of work among the working poor in the economy and the pay of other people. And similarly, a wider gap between median pay and high pay. While real hourly wages of workers at the 50th percentile rose from 1979 to 2018 by 12%, those at the 10th percentile rose by only 4.1%. While real hourly wages at the 70th percentile climbed by 17%, real hourly wages at the 30th percentile climbed by only 12%. Another such tension arises from discrimination against women, experienced and reported. Data show that women, white or black, are generally paid less than men for the same jobs and same performance, and they are promoted less far up the ladder. A similar phenomenon is said to be found among the LGBTQ and racial minorities. Tensions have also risen since the 1980s, most prominently in America, France, and Britain, over the fall in the wage rates of middle-income earners in some manufacturing and agricultural industries, relative to the middle-income earners generally. Trade may have played a part. As I argued last year in my book Dynamism, with a whole bunch of co-authors, new competition coming from farms and factories in Asia has surely had a negative impact on real wages in some industries in America. But whether this impact comes close to explaining the decline of relative wages in farming and manufacturing is not clear. And innovation may have played a part. It is interesting that the countries that have long been regarded as the innovation nations, America, Britain, and France, are the ones that have the newly distressed regions, while the countries that have always been regarded as trading nations, Germany and Holland, for example, have not been afflicted with that. With new competition coming from trade with Asia and elsewhere, the working class in general may well resent having to compete with the growing productivity of workers in much of Asia. As my frequent co-author Hyun Taek has argued, the steep rise of productivity in Asia over this epoch, in which growth of productivity in the West has been slower than in Asia, will continue to send the terms of trade between West and East on a downward slide. This force will act to reduce pecuniary rewards of work in the West. In America, resentment has risen over the trade agreements with other trading nations, which have been pictured as not delivering much, if any, gains to American workers. There is resentment, too, that the U.S. tax law, in enabling corporations to escape considerable taxation of profits by moving some operations overseas, leaves a heavier tax burden on workers' wage income, though counterarguments could be mounted. There is also resentment of the outsourcing of much work to low-cost labor. In America, as the population there has gone from 90% white in the 60s to barely 50% white now, whites in the so-called working class, especially those in parts of the South and Southwest, feel a loss of their political control. Many in this white working class appear to resent the rising competition for jobs and for government support. It's not clear, though, that there exist effective treatments for all or most of these complaints. Yet it is possible that all or most of these complaints would be diminished or mitigated if a revival of widespread grassroots innovation should emerge. Most, if not all, of these problems arose in the 50 years between 1970 or so right up to 2019, when quite different forces emerged. It was in those 50 years that the great slowdown arose, interrupted briefly by the Internet revolution. The antagonisms and frustrations were aggravated, and people's tolerance for differences was lost. Symmetrically, a reemergence of widespread innovation would be curative, restorative, though not altogether, I think. But whether grassroots innovation might somehow reawaken or be restored remains to be seen. Now, part two of what I have to say is the following. I want to share my thoughts on ways to respond to some of the needs in society not already addressed in adopted policies. I have rapport with much, maybe most, of the new goals being replaced by several members of Congress. Joe Stiglitz, who was a founding member of the Center and a longtime friend of mine, is an outstanding advocate of some programs of the new progressivism, which go beyond the classic justice of Rawls and Ramsey. I would be glad to see some of these programs tried out, though I will worry a little about the costs. With the introduction of any sizable body of additional government programs, there may be impacts from the increase of tax rates legislated to finance the new programs. Such programs could have sizable effects on the economy as a whole, perhaps a sizable toll on profits or investment, and maybe interest rates too, that are being underestimated or unexpected. But while it is apt to be difficult to quantify the costs, and the benefits too for that matter, it is possible in many cases to have a sense of their nature. The following example may be simpler than most, yet more complex, yet may be simpler than most, yet more complex than some. Work I started in 2019 found that a tax rate on wealth impacts on saving, thus on wealth accumulation. And a tax rate on profits impacts on investment, thus on capital accumulation. In the diagram here, which I won't show you, well, maybe I could have, developed by Hyuntek Hoon, the upward sloping, use your imagination, the upward sloping supply of wealth curve with interest rate on the vertical axis shows the supply of wealth to be an increasing function of the profit rate, and the downward sloping demand for capital curve shows the demand for capital to be a decreasing function of the real interest rate. The Hoon diagram shows how the intersection of the supply of wealth curve and the demand for capital curve jointly determine the long-run stock of capital, and if there is no public debt, the long-run level of wealth. The injection of a tax rate on wealth shifts up the supply of wealth curve, that was the upward sloping curve, thus operating to raise the profit rate and hence interest rates. The injection of a tax rate on profits shifts down the downward sloping capital curve. As a result, there is a contraction of the capital stock, and by the way, wealth too. Of course, that has further consequences, such as lower wages. Now, here in America, though, it is my feeling that present-day circumstances in America do amply warrant new initiatives to meet serious needs in society. It is important in deciding on the number of initiatives and their scale to weigh the increased benefits to society from expenditures against the cost to society of the resulting squeeze on capital, which also matters for economic welfare, by the way, such as wages. It is somewhat bothersome that Western nations, including us economists in the West, do not appear to be using any standard against which to engage undertaking these new expenditures against the period. I want to talk about a more classic view of these issues. In his classic 1928 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Saving, Frank Ramsey, the British philosopher, mathematician, and economist, deduced the conditions that must be satisfied for the optimum rate of investment, saving in his terminology, given the stock of capital and resulting national national income, and ultimate level of capital and thus consumption to be reached. That condition or formula of Ramsey determines the optimum size of current investment. If Ramsey were alive now, he would be surprised that the governments of the West, far from running surpluses to drive capital up to the level of what he called bliss, have been running deficits since the great slowdown began in the early 70s. In his famous 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, the moral philosopher John Rawls introduced the concept of economic justice toward the people engaged in producing the economy's output, thus its national income. Justice, he argued, requires taxing to redistribute wage income in such a way as to pull up the lowest wage rate as high as possible, the Maximin principle. This is engineered by a tax policy that aims to bring in the maximum tax revenue with which to raise the lowest wage to the highest level. Of course, this justice would not countenance diverting for use elsewhere for somewhere the revenue raised by taxing income. It is said that a colleague at Harvard asked Rawls one day how his theory would have dealt with other needs. The questioner may have had in mind needs for public goods, like national defense and public health, or maybe some of the needs that Jeff has talked about. Rawls is reported to have replied that he would want those with the lowest wages to decide how much of the total subsidy could be redirected to meet other needs. Larry Udell, who's a great Rawls scholar, may be here. He's the one that told me, told me of that exchange. I believe that whatever the various things we want in society, a great many of us do see justice, want us to see justice. Ramsey's intergeneration justice, Rawls's justice in the wage distribution, Gunnar Myrdal's interracial justice, and Betty Friedan's intergender justice in the labor market. Furthermore, programs aimed in that direction have been legislated, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit and various other tax credits, but we have to do so much more. Now, the last part of this presentation is the following. I think we have to go farther. I think we have to go deeper. Our society is in crisis. To see that, we need look no farther than the available evidence. Data from the GSS Household Survey shows that reported job satisfaction has been on a downhill slide since the first year it was measured in 1972. A good time to get going on that because that's when the slowdown started. Pew Research Center surveys from the early 70s to recent years show a downward trend in the reported degree of life satisfaction. And as you, I hope, won't surprise you, life satisfaction mirrors job satisfaction. Ann Case and Ann Deaton in Deaths of Despair show data on the outbreak of despair, linking it to economic developments. Ross Douthat in A Decadent Society writes of the deterioration of life in much of America. Yet the dissatisfaction and the despair that have mounted is not recognized nearly enough. We economists haven't recognized that people, in the West at least, need rich lives. They need an economy in which jobs are interesting, engaging, and occasionally fun too. A good life, a life of richness, as some humanists call it, means, for one thing, a sense of succeeding. The feeling you have when your ship comes in, called prospering, or when you gain recognition. The good life also means a kind of flourishing, using one's imagination, exercising creativity, and taking journeys into the unknown and acting on the world. A good economy holds out expectations of a good life. But a good life over much of society is more and more yet another unmet need. What is behind this massive dissatisfaction and cultural decay? My thesis in Mass Flourishing argued that a serious loss in the roots of indigenous innovation, namely a loss in the right values, largely accounts for the narrowing of innovation and thus the slowing of economic growth and the decline of job satisfaction and life satisfaction. But I have come to sense that the problem is bigger than that, and that's already pretty big. A new vision is required. I feel it is necessary somehow to reconceive the economy in which people, in such a way as that people to reconceive the economy in which people devote their working lives. It is hugely important, in my view, that governments, state and local, and thought makers draw away from a focus bordering on obsession with material gains, hence a focus on income and wealth. The main business of this economy should be on creating the new. I envision, this is my dream that came over in my last hours with this manuscript. I envision an economy that is in large part a sprawling space of myriad studios for creating new things. An economy resembling Hollywood's and Netflix's, full of people in the business of creating things. A smallish number of participants in the economy will have to go into conventional industries that offer them better pay because they need the money. In this new world, work is very engaging. The work is very engaging. Work is very engaging. Retiring from work would be like retiring from life. I do mean that. Radical, yes. Crazy, a little bit. Yet, maybe possible. I'm reminded America's government managed to save Europe after World War II thanks to the talents of Dean Acheson and John J. McCloy and Tom Schelling and other people. Perhaps the government can think big once more to get the nation out of its deep discontent. Thank you very much. Do I have time for a minute or two? Please, yeah. I may not recognize you behind your mask, so I'll just point, even if it's impolite.
I am Larry Udell.
Hi, Larry.
I'm a philosophy professor at Westchester University working on John Rawls, and I have access, thanks to...
Larry's the world's greatest Rawls scholar, by the way.
No, I'm an unknown Rawls scholar, relatively, actually, and I'm partly unknown because of my inability to convince other philosophers that Rawls' big mistake, which Ned Phelps has corrected, and that's how I know Ned, he needed to include employment as a primary good, so that in the original position, the parties consider this and, concerned with the interest of the least advantaged, adopt the full employment principle as fundamental to a just society. He forgot to say that because he wrote the book in 1971 when everyone was a Keynesian, and so he made a comment on page 274 of the book that the stabilization branch of government works to ensure reasonably full employment in the sense that those who want work can find it. And that's all he needed to say, and no one talked about it, and so it wasn't a part of his theory, and you have all these controversies about the difference principle, rearranging income and wealth distribution, which is the primary good, but what about employment? Well, employment is a cost that we have to pay in order to get the primary good of income and wealth, so we can use our leisure time, and it's just modeled wrong. So I think, I'm hoping, speaking to economists, but maybe some people will realize, and I think this is the fundamental demand to so much of what Jeffrey Sachs was talking about. Rawls, at the end of his life, came out in favor of government as employer of last resort. The Full Employment Act of 1945, which he instead favored the Employment Act of 46, which got passed, which worked to ensure reasonably full employment in this, but didn't ensure full employment. And at the end of his life, he made comments saying government should be, he went back to that, but Rawls scholars picked up on that. But it has to be a fundamental demand of justice that if involuntary unemployment is fundamentally unjust.
Thank you, Larry.
So that's my proposal. And actually, it was interesting because in dynamism, in the beginning of it, Ned, without probably even noticing that there's mentions employment as a primary good. You can read it's right there. He's the only person other than me who has made this claim. I think it's a fundamental claim, and that's what I'm hoping to convince philosophers of one of these days, and maybe some of you.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, we can take another question. All right.
Thank you. I'm Bob Remy Powers, and I'm the director of the Rawls Library, which is his personal research library. His house was full of books. It was one big library. That's where he did most of his writing. And when he after
Can you raise your microphone closer to your mask?
Yeah. So after he died, I got the bulk of the Harvard and Tufts took some volumes, but a very small part of it. And the reason I wanted to comment that this is a select group that I would be willing to open the library to. I have to be careful about, it's not really set up with a lot of administration, but anybody here who would like to visit the Rawls Library and read what Jack wrote in the margins of Ned's books. That's one thing of interest. Yeah, good. Yeah.
It's very interesting being in this library and having access. So I noticed that there were more books by Edmund Phelps than by any other economist. In this library, Bob there are over 100 books on economics that he's reading in the 1980s. He's really reading about macro and rational and all this stuff, which he never said anything about because he wasn't an economist, but he's reading. And so political economy, Ned's textbook, he read from cover to cover and marked the whole thing up. His wife commented to me one time when I met her that she said Jack couldn't pick up a book without marking it up. So you knew which books people gave him and he never got around to and the ones he really read. He loved rewarding work, and he recommended rewarding work to Philippe von Parijs, who's arguing, maybe some of you know who Philippe is, the advocate for universal basic income, which Rawls rejected. And Rawls wrote to von Parijs after rejecting the idea by noting that he didn't think Malibu surfers should be able to surf on public expense. So he rejected the difference principle, and that launched the whole debate. Von Parijs is still carrying it on. He wrote a letter to Philippe recommending that he read Rewarding Work, and that's how Philippe found out about you, and the debate's gone on. So that's how I found, I emailed Ned because, I said, I'm reading all these books of yours because Rawls read them all. I really call my view the Rawls-Phelps view is what you should think of it as.
Okay.
Anyone can just contact me afterwards if you have an interest in coming to Brattleboro, Vermont, one of the loveliest states in the Union. It's our big industry is tourism. Rich people come up from down country, leave your money, and go home. And at any rate, I would Ned, I hope you can get to Brattleboro, Vermont, and read your books in the marginalia.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for one more, actually.
One more short question. Yeah.
I'm Christine Helmer, Northwestern University. I would be very interested in hearing how you think the university could play a new role in your vision of flourishing. As the universities are in crisis, especially the humanities. I'm a humanities professor, and so I would just like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I didn't hear the question very well, but I think I got the gist of it. What are the universities doing for flourishing?
And
I have to say that I think the pivotal event in my life was my freshman year at Amherst when we were presented with a massive quantity of reading over 9 months from the Greek classics right up to more or less modern times. And that had a huge effect on the way I looked at life and the opportunities of life. Once I was sitting in a car with somebody from Amherst College who was riding to take me up to give a talk there, and I was starting to launch my admiration for this course, and he got sadder and sadder and sadder in his look, and he told me that it had been dropped. So I think Amherst and Columbia and lots of other places have really got to get the message across that, you know, life is real and life is important, is that you have incredible opportunities, especially in such a rich country, incredible opportunities for a rich life, but you have to understand what the riches of life are. And they're not in balance sheets, fun though it is to make some money. I'm not sure this is getting through. Others of you, most of you, many of you are, of course, professors, and so I imagine that many of you have noticed that. Thank you very much.